Okay, so hello and welcome everyone. I am very excited to kick off our first Pride program of 2022. But first, I do have a few quick logistical notes for everybody. First, I would like to ask everybody to please keep yourself muted during the program. We are going to have a Q&A at the end, but until then, we do want to try to avoid any sort of background interference. Thank you for doing that. Secondly, I would like to thank our friends, the Friends of the Morrill Memorial Library, for their generous sponsorship of this program. We love our friends, so if you see a friend, thank a friend. And finally, please welcome our presenter tonight, Joan Ilacqua. She is the Executive Director of the History Project. Previously, Joan served as the co-chair of the History Project's Board of Directors and as Harvard Medical School's Archivist for Diversity and Inclusion. She's a member of the Massachusetts State Historic Records Advisory Board and a former member of the New England Archivists Inclusion and Diversity Committee. She's a graduate of UMass Boston's Public History Master's Program and earned her Bachelor of Arts at the University of Puget Sound. Her background is in oral history and advocacy. And Joan, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy Pride, everyone. So for today's event, we're going to talk a bit about milestones in Massachusetts, specifically focused on LGBTQ history and the law. And we will kick it off. So just as an introduction, Heath gave a really great intro to who I am and what I do. I'm Joan Ilacqua. I'm Executive Director of the History Project, and we are a community-based archives in Boston. Our mission is to document, preserve, and share LGBTQ history of Boston, Massachusetts, and regionally of New England. We take that information and we share it back with the public. We have one of the largest independent LGBTQ archives in America. We have over 200 collections encompassing activists, individuals, organizations, materials from bars, materials from protests, a lot of ephemera. I usually joke, if you have any questions about gay history, we probably have something in the archives. So we've been around since 1980. We are, aside from me, totally volunteer run. And if you like today's presentation or if you want to learn more, please check us out at historyproject.org. So for today's talk, the sources about today's history are pretty varied. I rely on a book called Improper Bostonians, the History Project published in 1998, as well as Russ Lopez's work on LGBTQ Boston, and the work of Michael Bronski, another scholar, as well as contemporary newspapers and newsletters and some oral histories and accounts from LGBTQ community members. Before we kick off, I just want to say, in terms of language, I tend to use LGBTQ or queer to describe this community. I'm a millennial, so I like the word queer as sort of an encompassing term, with the understanding that people in the past, really people before the 1990s, did not use it in a sort of general sense. But that labels and language change over time. We're talking to each other in 2022, so I'm going to use some modern terms for this community. So our big topics for today are basically what's the LGBTQ fight for equality, and what are milestones for that fight in Massachusetts, and what is the sort of background history on these laws that are being repealed in the 20th century. I will say I'm not a lawyer, but I have done this research, and so I will do my best to answer any questions outside of this research, but as an archivist and public historian, I can point you in the right direction if I don't know something off the top of my head. So we will go through this history. I'm going to start us in the recent past, go all the way back to colonization, and then bring us forward to the present. And there will be time for a Q&A and discussion at the end. So please feel free to use the chat function, or we'll do some hand raising at the end, whatever feels comfortable. And so I wanted to start us in 1971. So 1971 was a public turning point for gay liberation in Massachusetts. It is the year that Boston held its first Pride March, and that Pride March was distinctly political. It commemorated the 1969 Stonewall riots, and it was organized by the city's homophile organizations. And homophile is a term that means loving the same. It was used in mostly the 50s and 60s to describe organizations that were interested in creating rights and protections for gay people. It was used instead of homosexual because homosexual had a medicalized slant to it. And so Boston had several organizations, including a chapter of the Managing Society for Gay Men, the Daughters of Bilitis for Women, who came together to plan this march. The week of the march, there were workshops and other events to bring the community together. And then about 200 people participated in the first Pride March. It was not sanctioned by the city, and it was organized around 4 major stops. They began at Jacques Cabaret, a drag bar in Bay Village in Boston. Marchers then moved on to Boston Police Headquarters on Berkeley Street. They continued to the State House on Beacon Hill. They stopped at St. Paul's Cathedral on Tremont, I believe. It's been a while since I've been downtown. And then they concluded with a rally on Boston Common. And the marchers stopped at each one of these sites and read a list of demands. Those included that entrapment cases cease, that vague laws, like those against loitering, disorderly conduct, lewd and lascivious behavior not to be used to harass gay people, that the police provide protection rather than harassment, that gay people should be included in civil rights legislation, that anti-sodomy statutes dating from the Puritan times would be eliminated from Massachusetts law, as well as a city ordinance against same-sex dancing. At the conclusion of this march, the marchers gathered on Boston Common for a ceremonial closet smashing. As I understand it, there was a cardboard closet, they ripped it apart, as well as sort of effigies of books written by psychiatrists at the time. To be gay was considered a mental illness, and so they ripped apart copies of these books written by psychiatrists. So the pictures up on this slide are from that first march in 1971. And most of these demands were met over time. They weren't met very quickly, but they were eventually met. And like I said, some of the laws that the marchers wanted repealed dated back to the Puritan era in Massachusetts. So we will go back to the beginning. So this is a 19th century engraving of the 1600s. That guy sort of right of center is Captain Miles Standish. He's standing with his men observing the immoral behavior of the Maypole festivities of 1628 at Marymount. So in Massachusetts, pre-colonization, we know that Native American and Indigenous communities had same-sex relationships. Depending on the tribe or group, people who we might now consider part of the gender fluid or modern trans community who held spiritual and ceremonial roles within tribes. And prior to the landing of the Puritans in Massachusetts in 1620, nations of Native people lived across America. Before colonizing Massachusetts, tribes including the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, and Pawtucket, among others, lived here. And it doesn't seem that there were specific Indigenous laws against homosexuality, again, depending on the tribe or group. When the Puritans, who were fleeing religious persecution in England, landed in 1620, they established a Christian settlement here. They had very strict rules and roles within family and society for men, women, and children, and anyone who broke those rules was strictly punished. So, for example, in 1628 or 1629, depending on which calendar you look at, the Plymouth militia overtook Thomas Morton's Marymount colony. Marymount was a colony in modern-day Quincy, and it consisted of formerly indentured servants of Morton and of Native American people. The Pilgrims considered Marymount's activities to be blasphemous, and Governor William Bradford wrote in of Plymouth Plantation, here's a quote, "They set up a maypole, drinking and dancing about it many days together, inviting the Indian women for their consorts, dancing and frisking together like so many fairies or furies rather, and worse practices. as if they had anew revived and celebrated the feasts of ye Roman goddess Flora, or ye beastly practices of ye mad Bacchanalians. So the Plymouth militia chopped down the maypole. They arrested Morton. Specifically, they charged him with supplying guns to the Indians, quote unquote. He was put in the stocks in Plymouth. He was given a trial. They eventually marooned him on the Isle of Shoals off of New Hampshire because it was believed that he was too well connected to be imprisoned or executed, which would later become the penalty for blasphemy in the colony. So the earliest statutes in the colonial era combined existing British laws with biblical prescriptions against same-sex behavior. In 1636, New Plymouth Colony listed sodomy and buggery among 8 offenses punishable by death. 1641, Massachusetts Bay Bodies of Liberties included the following law: if, quote, if any man lieth with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed abomination, they both shall surely be put to death. During this time, this sort of same-sex attraction was considered moral degeneracy, and punishments were imposed as penance. The fear was that same-sex behavior would provoke fire from the heavens on the entire community, not just on the people engaging in it. And so it was swiftly and severely punished. When Plymouth became part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1691, sodomy was then termed buggery. It was still a detestable and abominable act, and remained a capital crime until 1805 in Massachusetts. So the Puritans are a bummer, I will say. During this time period as well, we start to see the first anti-cross-dressing laws come into play in Massachusetts. And by cross-dressing, I mean wearing clothing that does not relate to your perceived gender. It is a term that's generally not used now, but this is basically what was happening in the 1600s. And we see gender variant people punished for cross-dressing before an official law is established in 1696. Gender variant people are defined by historian Susan Stryker as those who live or act in ways that challenge gender norms, and gender variant people throughout history may have been cisgender, transgender, genderqueer. They may have identified in other ways, and we unfortunately don't know much about these people who I'm going to mention beyond what they were charged with. So the earliest one I've seen is Joseph Davis. In 1652, he was charged with putting on women's clothing. He had to pay a 10-shilling fine and make a public acknowledgement of his fault. Dorothy Hoyt in 1677 was summoned to court for putting on man's apparel. Hoyt fled the county. Their father, John Hoyt, appeared in court for them. The court ordered that Hoyt be apprehended and severely whipped or forced to pay a fine of 40 shillings in corner money. Deborah Beyer, 1691, had to submit a 10-pound bond and stand on a stool in a public place wearing a paper that read, "for putting on man's apparel." Mary Henley similarly was punished for cross-dressing in 1692. By the time we get to the Revolutionary War, we see cross-dressing happening in a different way here. There are 2 women that we know of who cross-dressed as part of the war effort. One was punished, one was not. The first, Anne Bailey, enlisted in the Continental Army using the name Samuel Gay. Bailey was caught pretty quickly, indicted and tried in August 1777. Bailey was sentenced to 2 months in jail, fined 16 pounds, and ordered to pay court costs for their crime. Whereas Deborah Sampson, who was born in Plimpton, Massachusetts in 1760, she enlisted in 1782. She used her deceased brother's name, Robert Shirtleff, to join the Continental Army. She participated in combat. Eventually, she became ill, and her quote-unquote true sex was revealed. Sampson received an honorable discharge. She later married, she had children, and she wrote a book about her experience. And that image on the right, that's a frontispiece from Sampson's memoir. On the left is actually a History Project volunteer from the late 80s dressed up as another Puritan, Sarah Norman, punished for lewd and lascivious behavior. But Sampson is sort of an interesting figure in that she petitioned for a military pension for her service. She received it, as well as a spousal benefits for her husband. And after the war, she went back to wearing women's clothing and really acting in kind of a gender normative way. And that's probably why she got away with talking about it. But we see this anti-cross-dressing law and the attitudes that are against cross-dressing in Massachusetts up through the 1900s. And so these really early laws here have a strong impact on society even hundreds of years later. Then we have the Victorians. So in the 1800s, in the post-revolution period, we have this tension between people who are writing very openly and in some cases poetically about their romantic interest or romantic friendship with others of the same sex, while some of the first cases against same-sex behavior are being tried in Massachusetts. So I usually joke with the Victorians that everyone you read about in English class is usually on this slide. But lots of artists and authors associated with Massachusetts were writing about either their same-sex attraction, writing to in their journals or in their published work, writing to friends and lovers about their romantic feelings. And there's a really strong documentary record here, mostly of incredibly privileged people who were able to be eccentric or really had the privilege to not be underground. One of the issues with doing LGBTQ history is that the people that we most often learn about are the most privileged, who had some leeway in their lives to leave records about what they were doing and what they were thinking. And on the other side of things, we have people who were arrested or tried, were written about in newspapers or in other court documents, whose personal views and feelings we don't get to learn about. So from left to right here, I have a picture of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Hold on. I have Thoreau first. Sorry, I deleted one of my notes. So Henry David Thoreau is on the left, then Ralph Waldo Emerson, I believe. I might have mixed up my transcendentalists, and I apologize for my joke about English class earlier. Emily Dickinson, and then Oscar Wilde. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, transcendentalist, kept journals throughout his life. In his journal while he was a student at Harvard, he had a huge crush on a guy named Martin Gay. He obsessed with this young scholar. He waxed poetically about him. And even though Emerson later edited and removed portions of his journals later in life, we know that he had this crush on Martin for about 2 years. And the journals even include sketches of Martin. Thoreau, similarly, if you read his poetry, you can see his interest in other men. Usually here, and again, I apologize for deleting this, there's a poem of his called "Alas, I Knew a Gentle Boy," where he talks about a guy who he spent the summer with and how he may have loved him had he loved him less. It's very romantic. It's very open about his romance, and it's not really friendly. Emily Dickinson, on the other hand, she was very intense in her romantic feelings for several women throughout her life. That included her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert, and later Gilbert's childhood friend, Kate Scott. When Emily Dickinson died, the majority of her poetry was made available, although it was heavily edited by her family to remove references to her female love. Some of what survives, which includes a pretty salacious quote about licking the stamp of Susan's letter to get a taste of her, exists, as well as other poems about her romantic interest in other women. At the tail end of the 1800s is the trial of Oscar Wilde. And so we see a crackdown on this kind of flamboyant, romantic, artistic love between people of the same sex happening then. In Massachusetts, we have the first reported sodomy case tried in the state. Commonwealth v. Snow, which was decided in 1873. This was a case where two guys were caught in the act with one another. And the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that Willard Smith, who was the solicited party in the act, was an accomplice of another man, and even though they were doing something that was completely consensual, that it was illegal. And that was upheld by the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. In the, nope, I wasn't going to change slides yet, sorry. There are a couple of other cases in the latter part of the 1800s. In 1887, Massachusetts legislature enacts a statute creating a separate crime from the sodomy law, and that's called unnatural and lascivious acts. The penalty for that was less than for sodomy. Indictments for this crime did not have to give a description of the act charged, but a defendant could ask for a bill of particulars from police. And the first recorded case under this law was Commonwealth v. Dill. That was decided in 1894. And the unanimous decision by the Massachusetts Supreme Court was that if the defendant committed an unnatural and lascivious act, that in and of itself was sufficient to prove his guilt. In 1908, the Supreme Court decided a case called Commonwealth v. Delano, which was exceedingly brief and non-specific. It decided that, quote, any and all unnatural and lascivious acts were outlawed by the 1887 statute. And so Massachusetts is trying to police or control same-sex activities in the state. And we start to see in the early 1900s an attempt to use the law to maintain a certain level of moral standards, particularly in Boston. And that brings us to the true name law. And so in Boston, in the first half of the 20th century, regulation of public behavior was carried out by a number of self-appointed watchdog groups. These people were keepers of the city's morals. Boston in particular had the Watch and Word Society, who would do things like banish immoral theater productions. And that could be anything that was considered, ranged from being too titillating to including cross-dressers in their productions. For a time, to be banned in Boston was considered a badge of honor for touring productions. It was also a means of drumming up publicity for other cities. And we have examples of plays that were banned in Boston that are mounted in Quincy and other cities to great fanfare. Also during the early 1900s, Harvard has an infamous secret court that takes place in 1920 in investigating homosexual activity among students. Ultimately, 8 students were expelled. A graduate student had ties completely severed with Harvard, and they fired an assistant professor. And over 100 years later, Harvard's still coming to terms with the secret court in the way that it tried to root out gay students in 1920. In 1915, another law was enacted prohibiting resorting to any cafe, restaurant, or saloon for, quote, the purpose of immoral solicitation or immoral bargaining. So by the time we get to 1918, Massachusetts or Boston passes a law called the True Name Law. That's part of this suite of morality clauses. So the True Name Law is passed in 19 at the tail end of World War I. It's supposed to regulate hotels and boarding houses, meaning that any lodger has to sign a register using their true name under penalty of arrest or fine. And it was part of an attempt to stop men from visiting sex workers. They were particularly concerned about the spread of venereal disease, especially as it related to the war effort and how it could impact the war by taking sailors and soldiers out of commission. What happened was unintentional victims of the True Name Law were unmarried couples going to hotels, adulterers, and people who cross-dressed, like Ethel Kimball, who is featured on this slide. The True Name Law was cited as late as 1949, although at that point they were citing it humorously. President Truman was visiting the state, and he was told that he needed to explain what his middle initial stood for to be able to sign into the hotel. As a very quick story on Ethel Kimball, who used many names over the course of their life, was somebody who would dress in masculine clothing and then commit crimes. Basically, as early as about 1910, we see news articles talking about Ethel Kimball dressing masculinely, using a false name, and then doing things like passing fake checks, stealing cars, doing other sorts of unsavory things. Despite being caught over and over again and being sent to the Women's Reformatory at Sherborne, the Boston Psychiatric Hospital, or Psychopathic Hospital, excuse me, Ethel continued to do this, and they used names including James Wilson, John Hathaway. At one point, they used the name William, and they claimed to be a graduate of MIT. Ethel gets married twice during these escapades, once to a woman named Louise Eichler in Somerville, and then once to a woman named Pearl Davis in Parsonsfield, Maine. And at one point, Ethel is caught under this true name law. They're using a fake name, they get caught, they get persecuted for it. In 1921, Massachusetts has a Supreme Court case called Commonwealth v. Porter, where we start to see again that Massachusetts is sort of doubling down on this, these morality laws, especially in regards to same-sex activity. In that case, the court upheld a conviction for maintaining a nuisance, meaning a place where people either went to meet one another or to meet with sex workers. The house in which, quote, indecent and unnatural acts were committed by men with other of their sex was found to be in violation of state law, even though the earlier law did not say that activity between two men was illegal. So this is all setting the stage for the 1950s and later, when these laws would finally be challenged. I wanted to share the story of Prescott Townsend because he is one of the people who is arrested under the Unnatural and Lascivious Act statute that we talked about being on the books in the late 1800s. So even though attitudes toward homosexuality were evolving post-World War II, these laws were still being used to police people. So Prescott Townsend is a pretty fascinating figure in local gay history. He was born into a prestigious Boston Brahmin family in 1894. He attended Harvard. He served in the Navy in World War I. He also bankrolled artists and actors in Provincetown. And he was pretty out for this time period. He was a very, like I said, privileged person. He did not keep himself hidden particularly. And during World War II, Townsend worked at a Fall River shipyard as part of the war effort. And he was charged with committing an unnatural and lascivious act with another man. The punishment for this was to pay a $15 fee, which Townsend could have easily paid, and he refused. He ultimately spent 18 months in prison on Deer Isle. And in his time in prison, that's often cited as the impetus for his later organizing and activism. After his incarceration, he was shunned from polite society. His name was literally stricken from the social register in Boston and New York. And he began to organize with other gay men in Boston. He established the Boston branch of the Mattachine Society, which was an early gay rights organization started by Harry Hay in California in 1955. And Townsend supported the gay liberation movement with the funds that he still had. It's rumored that he paid to print the flyers advertising Boston's first Pride activities. And so Townsend is caught under this in, I think, 1945. In 1954, we still see people being charged with this sodomy law. In Jaquith v. Commonwealth, Kenneth Jaquith was convicted under the, quote, Unnatural and Lascivious Act statute. And the Supreme Court unanimously decided that although the Constitution required sufficient definition of any criminal offense, the words unnatural and lascivious were, quote, of common usage and indicate with reasonable clarity the kind and character of conduct which the legislature intended to prohibit and punish. These words have a well-defined, well-understood, and generally accepted meaning, signifying irregular indulgence in sexual behavior, and so on and so forth. Basically, they were saying that whatever a police officer or prosecutor felt to be unnatural and lascivious was sufficient for prosecution. And so the law stayed on the books for another 20 years until 1974. In 1974, Commonwealth v. Balthasar overruled Jaquith, acknowledged a right to privacy as defined by the United States Supreme Court. And in that case, the defendant argued that acts between consenting adults were lawful. And ultimately, that cleared the way for same-sex activity to be legal in Massachusetts, at least, although the defendant in that case did not win his case because he wasn't doing something consensual. But in any case, that brings us to something that's a little bit like the plot of Dirty Dancing. But in 1969, same-sex dancing was illegal in Boston. And at that time, youth, people basically 18 to 21, were interested in organizing dances for one another. And so in 1969, the minister of the Charles Street Meeting House, Reverend Randy Gibson, was approached by some young people who wanted to hold a dance. He was sympathetic to their plight, and he allowed a gay dance at the meeting house in March of 1970. John Kuyper, reflecting on this 1970 dance in a gay community news article years later, wrote, quote, "I had never witnessed same-sex dancing in Boston outside the murky confines of the Other Side, a gay bar, then on Broadway in Bay Village." Once the gay dances started, and I will say the Charles Street Meeting House held 2 gay dances, neighbors complained, and Mayor Kevin White canceled the 3rd, which was supposed to happen during Pride Month in 1970. But students began organizing them in other parts of the city in the greater Boston area. In Cambridge, the Student Homophile League held its first gay liberation dance in 1970 at the Free University at Harvard in Lawrence Hall, which was an abandoned Harvard building scheduled for demolition. And that dance attracted somewhere between 400 and 500 participants. Dances became a way for young people to meet and socialize. They were held at the Oddfellows Hall in Cambridge, at Arlington Street Church in Boston. You couldn't be arrested for same-sex dancing now. It is unclear if this prohibition is still in the books. I've done some research. I've reached out to some lawyer friends, and it seems like it is, although I don't think it could be upheld in a court of law at this point in time. One of the most famous gay rights cases in Massachusetts took place in 1978. And so the 2 pictures here are protesters outside of the Boston Public Library at Copley Square, and a copy of Gay Community News from April 1st, 1978. And so Boston police responded to citizen complaints about cruising in the Boston Public Library bathroom. And in 1978, police started aggressively targeting gay patrons, assigning plainclothes police officers to the detail in the bathroom of the Boston Public Library, and they tried to entice men to break the law. This is entrapment, and in 2 weeks in March 1978, police ultimately arrested 103 men. And the charges ranged from indecent exposure to open and gross lewdness, which was a felony. But it wasn't clear if any of these men had actually broken the law. Ultimately, only one of the 103 defendants was found guilty, and that conviction was later overturned. Outraged by this and other anti-gay measures, Boston's gay community came out and protested. And in the middle of this, a young attorney named John Ward found a possibility to help. John Ward founded GLAAD, the Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders, in 1978. He filed GLAAD's first case, Doe v. McNiff, 1 year later, and that charged Boston Public Library and police officials with violating the civil rights of a man arrested at the library, who was later not found guilty. Although that case took about a decade to resolve and ended in settlement. There's a similar entrapment case that takes place in 1980, where police actions entrapping gay men into soliciting them and then arresting them as disorderly persons or lewd, wanton, and lascivious persons were shot down. And that related to a public rest area where police were trying to do the same thing 2 years later. Through the 1980s, we see a couple more victories in the fight for gay rights. Some of these took a very long time to come to fruition and start in 1974 when Elaine Noble was elected. Elaine Noble became the first openly lesbian or gay candidate elected to a state legislature. She was a member of the Massachusetts House of Representatives. She was part of the first delegation of gay men and lesbians invited to the White House by Jimmy Carter to discuss LGBTQ rights. And during her time in office, she introduced a gay rights bill along with Barney Frank. And it would take until 1989 for that bill to pass. So after years of extensive lobbying, protesting, and actions, including one time where 400 gay people stormed the Senate floor, that gay rights bill was passed in 1989. Arlene Isaacson, who is co-chair of the Massachusetts Gay and Political Caucus, was quoted as saying, quote, "It's historic. It shows that the legislature finally believes what we've been saying all along. This bill doesn't give us special privileges or special treatment, but rather it simply grants us equal protection under the law. Finally, we won't be second-class citizens." And that 1989 bill or law banned discrimination against gay men and lesbians in housing, employment, credit, insurance, and public accommodations. At the time, it was only the second statewide gay rights bill in the nation. Wisconsin passed the first in 1982. We also see in the 1980s protests about foster parent rights. So until 1985, the Massachusetts Department of Social Services had no specific policy about placing foster children with gay or lesbian parents. In 1983, Governor Michael Dukakis had initiated a policy asking for information on the, quote, sexual preferences of prospective foster parents with the plan to place children with, quote, traditional families. The Boston Globe ran an article in May 1985 called, quote, "Some oppose foster placement with gay couple." And by that afternoon, the state had removed a child from a gay couple's family. Governor Dukakis called for a review of foster care policy. And within 2 weeks, the Massachusetts House of Representatives voted to ban gay foster parents. The Senate debated to uphold the bill, and the Massachusetts Department of Social Services announced a policy emphasizing the importance of placing children in traditional family settings. Gay and lesbian parents weren't explicitly banned, but they were designated as a last resort. And the policy mobilized the community. It responded with a campaign against Dukakis. The Gay and Lesbian Defense Committee led the Foster Equality Campaign, which is the image all the way on the right on this screen is one of the protests that they held. They protested in front of the State House. They kept the pressure on Dukakis. They demanded that he produce evidence that traditional married couples are the ideal family settings for foster children. People protested at Pride. In 1987, an effigy of Governor Dukakis was erected in front of the State House and plastered with foster equality stickers. At 1988, Mass Act Out had a carnival game for $1. A person could throw an egg at a photo of Dukakis, and they were raising money for AIDS research, I believe. And when Dukakis made his 1988 presidential bid known, protesters began to organize around the country. Eventually in 1990, the Dukakis administration reversed its policy, and as of 1993, the state allowed second parent adoptions by a parent of the same sex. When we get to the 2000s, marriage equality becomes the big issue. In the early 2000s, Massachusetts becomes the same state to legalize same-sex marriage, and that fight legally started in 2001 when 7 same-sex couples applied for marriage licenses. They were all denied. Gay and lesbian advocates and defenders, who I mentioned back at the Boston Public Library, took up the case. They filed a lawsuit, Goodridge v. Department of Public Health, and argued that denying same-sex couples equal marriage rights was unconstitutional. Suffolk Superior Court ruled against the plaintiffs in 2002. GLAAD appealed that decision to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And on November 18, 2003, the Supreme Judicial Court ruled 4-3 that the state's ban on same-sex marriage was unconstitutional. And that ruling, written in part by Chief Justice Margaret Marshall, states, quote, "The Massachusetts Constitution affirms the dignity and equality of all individuals. It forbids the creation of second-class citizens. In reaching our conclusion, we've given full deference to the arguments made by the Commonwealth, but has failed to identify any constitutionally adequate reason for denying civil marriage to same-sex couples." And so the state began issuing marriage licenses on May 17th, 2004. And this Goodridge ruling caused shockwaves around the country. Some cities and states allowed same-sex couples to marry. Others worked to pass legislation banning same-sex marriage altogether. On June 26, 2015, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that same-sex couples could marry nationwide in Oakbarrow v. Hodge, establishing a new civil rights for LGBTQ people. And the images here, the top left is actually a protest in Providence, Rhode Island, but I really like their signs. The other two are newspapers from May 2004. And so some of the current fight that is happening, at least here in Massachusetts, or most recently in Massachusetts, relates to the rights and protections of transgender people. In 2007, an act relative to gender-based discrimination and hate crimes was introduced, and the legislation was meant to add Massachusetts to a list of states that had provided equal opportunity to people of all genders, to amend existing hate crime law to include transgender people. An organization called the Transgender Equal Rights Coalition, which included the Mass Trans Political Coalition, succeeded in obtaining passage of this statewide non-discrimination and hate crime protections, with the exception of public accommodation, and that happened in 2011. In 2013, Mass Trans Political Coalition filed legislation to add protections for trans people in public places like hotels, restaurants, medical offices, public transportation, etc. And eventually the organization co-chaired Freedom for All Massachusetts. They ran a campaign to add gender identity to the public accommodations law, and that passed in 2016. Enough opposition was received to put the law in question, and it was added to the 2018 ballot. And Freedom for All Massachusetts launched the Yes on 3 campaign, which is what all three of these images are. On the right is Laverne Cox speaking at a Yes on 3 rally. On the left are some students from Harvard Medical School protesting in support of Yes on 3. And in 2018, the Yes on 3 campaign was launched to defend and uphold protections for trans people in public accommodations, and it won with 67.8% of votes. Massachusetts became the 18th state to fully protect trans people from discrimination under the law. Most recently in Massachusetts, we have come a long way. There's been efforts to ban conversion therapy on minors. There's been efforts to allow non-binary gender markers on licenses and IDs. And as far as I know, there's still lobbying around expanding that to other government documents. But this year in particular, the LGBTQ community continues to rally around those who are still prosecuted, underrepresented, underserved, or ignored. I usually say, we've come a real long way, and there's always still work to do. It feels particularly important this year to point out what some of that work is. This year, we've seen legislative attacks on trans people, on LGBTQ youth, on reproductive freedoms. And even though there's been so much progress, there's more work to do. So if you are interested in getting involved in any of these fights, I work for a nonprofit, so I can't tell you who to vote for, but I can tell you some things that you could do if you're interested. And that includes signal boosting activists, donating to organizations focused on LGBTQ plus protections, voting if you can vote, and showing up and protesting if you feel compelled to. You don't need to do all four. but anything you can do to make it, wow, anything you can do makes a difference, especially as it feels like these laws are coming closer and closer to us here in Massachusetts. So with that, here we are in 2022. I want to say thank you for staying with me for my 400-year plus overview of legal LGBTQ cases and battles in Massachusetts. As always, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment so we can do some Q&A, but please feel free to reach out to me at info@historyproject.org with any questions about queer history. If I don't know, or if the History Project doesn't have it, I can point you in the right direction. And please check us out at historyproject.org. We have digital collections, exhibits. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. If anyone knows a young person who knows TikTok, we'd love to be there too, but we're not there yet. And with that plug, I will stop sharing.
So thank you, Joan. If anybody has any questions for Joan at this point, please feel free to either pop it in the chat, or you can raise your hand or unmute yourself. To start us off, I do have one question that came in to the chat. So while everybody's thinking about their questions, I can read this one off. So someone asked, given the erasure of queerness in many historical studies, can you talk about how historians who are doing work like yours are able to determine which figures are or aren't queer, given how ambiguous it sometimes is?
This is a very vague answer. It really depends on who you're talking about. And some of it involves reading between the lines and some of it doesn't. So for someone like, to use an example of someone up here, Emily Dickinson, you don't really need to read between the lines. I can't say how she identified, if she was interested in men and women, if she was just interested in women, if she was interested in women romantically and no one else. There are a lot of labels that we use now that don't translate one-to-one to historical figures. But when you see people in their writing talking about their romantic interests very explicitly, then you can know. Another local Boston figure is Charlie Gibson, actually. The Gibson House Museum in Back Bay for a very long time did not interpret Charlie as a gay man. He founded the museum. He lived in, it is a museum dedicated to interpreting his family home. He lived there, and it's not clear if he or early archivists and museum curators erased his queerness. We know about his romantic entanglements from his own letters, as well as how he is described by other people in the community. And so we see him pop up. There's like a whole subculture in Boston of what I'd call quote unquote confirmed bachelors, who talk about like, oh, did you see Charlie at the party? And, those sorts of ways you can tell. And the other way is, again, if people are being arrested or convicted or outed in public documents like newspapers, that's a pretty easy way to tell that somebody is part of this community. It really is hard the further back you go to find lots of people, because people needed to be closeted to be safe. And some ways that you could do that were to be a confirmed bachelor, to be a spinster, to live in a boarding house with other members of the same sex, to work at a women's college. And that's not saying that everyone at women's colleges or everyone living at boarding houses or anything like that are part of this community, but those are some of the ways we do it. But yeah, if you want to learn more, there's actually a really great book written by Ken Torino on interpreting historic houses as queer spaces and talking about the people who lived there. That one's really great. There are some others, if you had specific interests. There's a lot of historians working on queer history right now.
Okay, thank you. And I did get another question in the chat. So this person is asking about after the Puritan era, let's say, why did the state or the population of Massachusetts continue to punish homosexuality so much or so stubbornly? And they note, the Puritans believed that homosexuality would cause the entire community to be punished. Did that carry through, or was it just kind of the continuation of an established precedent?
I think it was the continuation of an established precedent more so than it was. You start to see with the Victorians, in particular, people judging one another based on what perceived moral norms are. So you see the rise of things like the temperance movement in the late Victorian era, Gilded Age. You see things like women in particular trying to socialize immigrants. And I say that like in the historical context of the 1800s, where people are trying to sort of, for the good of all, ensure that everyone is acting in a way that is morally appropriate. So this is part of that. Generally, though, sodomy laws were used, and the lewd and lascivious crime were used against people who were lower class, who were people of color, people who were easily persecuted. And so I think it was another way of upholding class standing. But, and this is, I should say, these laws are really typical across the country. It's mandated on a state level, but other states have, I think, pretty similar laws happening, even ones that were not established by Puritans in the 1600s. And so, yeah, it's when you start going west, and I'm being a little vague, but when you start seeing people sort of expand to the west in these kind of liminal spaces that might not be states yet, you might see some more gay activity happening. There are lots more examples, particularly of women cross-dressing kind of on the frontier and in mining colonies, and it not being a big deal because it's not the same kind of society as we had on the East Coast at the time. Eventually that goes away, and you see the same laws popping up across the country.
Okay, if anybody has any other questions.
And I'm happy to talk about happier things than like people getting arrested. It's a little, this presentation can be a little bleak, and I think in the end, things change very drastically, very quickly in Massachusetts. And for the better, I think, but.
Looks like everybody is satisfied, I guess, with the lecture that you've presented tonight, Joan. So I guess I'm gonna close this out at this point. So I just want to give everyone a big thanks for attending tonight. We will be sending out the recording of the event shortly, so keep your eye out for that email. And once again, thank you to the Friends for their sponsorship, and of course to Joan for her very excellent presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And again, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions or are looking for a list of resources, or a high school or college student writing a paper. Archivists are always happy to help.
All right, thank you.